It's the middle of September, but it's also the middle of Octember. Yes, that's the reading event where we're studying all about not just octopuses, but cephalopods in general. But yes, especially the octopus. Hi, I'm Kim, and this is An Oasis of Books. Today I thought I'd bring you a short update on one of the books that I have just read for Octember. Now, I ordered this book used, and I was hoping it would get here in time, and it did. It got here a few days ago, and I am in love with this book. I have finished reading it. I'll probably read it again because it was so enjoyable. It's a short book, but packed with information and written so well. It's The Lady and the Octopus, how Jeanne Villepreux-Power invented aquariums and revolutionized marine biology. This book is just so gorgeous. Obviously, the cover, look at that, and the colors. Oh, it's just so nice. Even the back has a photograph of Jeanne Villepreux-Power on it. Yep, that's from 1861. And when you take off the dust jacket, the hardcover book underneath has the same cover. Isn't that astounding? I just absolutely am amazed with the gorgeosity of this book. And it doesn't stop with the cover either. The inside of this book is full of engravings, woodcuts, illustrations, famous paintings, little known paintings, even a wonderful painting by Jeanne Villepreux-Power herself. And the fact that it still exists is a miracle, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Now, though Jeanne spent most of her life living and studying in Sicily, in the town of Messina, she was born in France. Now, this was the 1790s, and of course, in the early 1790s, Napoleon was in charge, and France was at war with Europe. And in 1793, about the time that King Louis XVI suffered the guillotine, Jeanne's parents got married, and the next year, on September 25th, 1794, Jeanne was born. This was just after Robespierre was executed and the Reign of Terror and all those mass executions were ended. Now, though it was a time of chaos in France, Jeanne's family lived far away from Paris, far away from all that conflict, in a very small town in the countryside called Juillac. And that's where Jeanne grew up. But though she lived in a sleepy little town, Jeanne's life was not untouched by tragedy. When she was 12, her mother died. The next year, when she was 13, Jeanne walked all the way to Paris. That was not an easy journey. It was actually very difficult in several ways. But I won't go into that here. You can read the book and find out. But once in Paris, Jeanne made a life for herself. She became an apprentice to a seamstress, and within a few years had already designed a wedding dress for a princess. And it was through her work as a seamstress that she came into contact with a merchant who became her husband. And that is how she ended up going to Sicily. And that's where she discovered an entirely new passion for her, a fascination and a love for sea creatures, most especially the Argonauts. And that's what this book, The Lady and the Octopus, is all about. Now, don't get me wrong. Although it does go into great detail about the Argonauts, it's never dry or boring for a moment because it also includes lots of other interesting information. And the narrative writing is so good. It just holds your attention. From sentence to sentence, page to page, you don't want to put this book down. Now, it's arranged in 6 chapters with an introduction and an epilogue as well. The introduction does a good job setting the scene for your study of the mystery of the Argonauts. And the epilogue talks about marine biology as it is today and how it's going to continue in the future. But the 6 chapters in the middle, they're all about Jeanne Villepreux-Power. And they're basically arranged around the 6 different stages of her life, or the 6 different roles she played, really. The first one being the seamstress, the second, the explorer, the third, the inventor, the fourth, the detective, the fifth, the reporter, and the 6th, the luminary. This book also comes with a super helpful timeline at the back that I really appreciated as I read throughout this book. It also comes with a glossary of all the scientific terms, a source notes section where you can find out where all of the quotations and different facts came from, and a section with many books listed for, further suggested reading now that you too are fascinated by the study of Argonauts and cephalopods in general. In case you're not aware, an Argonaut is the term for an octopus that lives in a shell. It's its own distinct species, and it's been studied for a very long time because it's such a curious marine animal. Now, the title of this book says that Jeanne Villepreux-Power invented aquariums, and she did. Up until that time, scientists were only able to study and learn more about animals by studying dead specimens. And so our Lady Jeanne was doing this, but she knew she could learn so much more from the animals if she could watch them living out their lives, going about their day-to-day activities. And so she came up with the idea of an aquarium. It wasn't called that at first. It got that name later, but that's what it was. Glassmaking had recently become a much bigger thing due to the arrival of steam power. And so she came up with a glass container so that she could bring the Argonauts inside and study them alive. And it worked. Took some trial and error, but it worked. Even more than that, though, Jeanne Villepreux-Power came up with what later would be called power cages, named after her, which basically were large wooden cages put into the sea, anchored there with, very specific slatting that let the water go through, which kept the water fresh, but didn't allow the octopuses, the Argonauts, out. And this way she could watch the animals in their natural habitat, and she learned so much more there than anywhere else. Now, there were several mysteries about the Argonauts at that time that scientists had not been able to figure out. Two in particular. One was, do they create the shells that are on them, or do they steal these shells from other animals, like the way hermit crabs do? And the second mystery was, where are the males of this species? We've not seen any males. So one of the things that Jeanne Villepreux-Power wanted to do was to investigate, experiment, and solve these mysteries. And she had success. Because she was able to study them live, she was able to see and do things no other scientists had been able to do up to this point. And she discovered that the Argonauts definitely make their shells themselves. They're born without a shell, very tiny. However, they almost immediately begin creating their shell. And how they do that is incredible. In fact, incredible is exactly the right word, because back then the other scientists had a very difficult time believing this. Partially, this is because she was a woman and women were not considered, capable of being that smart and that good of a scientist. But she showed them otherwise, and she did have some staunch allies amongst the male scientists who would read her works and show her experiment results, and she gradually did gain respect, by and large, throughout the scientific community at that time. Through her studies of the live Argonauts in the water, she discovered that the shells were not dry, brittle, hard, white. They were clear, translucent, and flexible when they were in the water. And she discovered that the two arms, known as membrane arms, as you can see here, were not sails, as so many scientists up to then had believed, carrying the Argonaut across the water as if it was in a shell boat. Instead, these were what was responsible for creating the shell, hard as that seems to comprehend. And she had the proof to show that this was true. In fact, recently it's been proven that the Argonauts, instead of using their shell as a boat to sail across the sea, use their shell more like a submarine. But I'll leave the details of that for you to find out in the book when you read it. As to the question of where are the males, well, Jeanne Villepreux-Power mostly figured that one out, but not quite all of it. She did discover part of the mail. Let's leave it at that. But it was such an unusual and surprising answer that was right in front of the scientists all along. It's understandable that they didn't figure it out immediately. One of the things I loved about this book is that it is jam-packed with tidbits of tangential, trivial information. It's all related, but it's not, necessarily directly related. But it's so interesting and forms the context, the broad background for what you're reading about in Jeanne Villepreux-Power's life. For instance, we learn about Mary Anning. Now, I'd never heard of Mary Anning before, but she was one of the first fossil hunters and paleontologists. She was in England, and she didn't do this for the love of science, although I'm sure she grew quite knowledgeable and interested in what she was doing. She did it for the money. She lived where she could find these fossils everywhere around her near the coast in England, and so she sold them. And many of these came into the possession of Jeanne Villepreux-Power. Here's another interesting tidbit. Argonauts like to hitchhike. They ride on jellyfish or debris in the water, and scientists still haven't quite figured out why. The enormously tragic event that happened later in Jeanne Villepreux-Power's life is that when she and her husband were reaching what we would call retirement age, they decided to move to England. And because they had so many things, most especially Jeanne's huge collection of specimens, they sent separately 16 boxes of her work, all the specimens and all her notes, all the experiments she'd done, and everything she hoped to go through, organize, and shape into a presentation, perhaps for a museum of sorts. Well, as often happened in those days, a shipwreck occurred and everything of hers was lost. So this is the only scientific illustration of Jeanne Villepreux-Power's that still exists today. And it is, as this book mentions, exquisitely done in its own habitat, showing how much better it is to study animals live in their own environment. It was only fortunate that years later she discovered a few of her writings that she had somehow overlooked and had not packed along with everything else. And that was very helpful for her future experiments, because she didn't stop. She didn't give up. Later, she took her husband back to Sicily for a couple of years for his health. And while there, she collected all new specimens. And so she was able to go on with her experimenting and her writing and her work. Because, as this book goes to great efforts to point out, about half of the work of the science is the study and the experimenting and the writing, and the other half is the sharing it with everyone else, making sure that that information gets out there to the public, but especially to the other scientists, so that they can continue on with the work and not repeat unnecessarily the mistakes you've made, but learn from what you've done and move forward. And despite the fact that she was a woman in a very male-dominated environment there in the scientific community of that time, she did a wonderful job of sharing as well as doing the science. Now, Jeanne Villepreux-Power has been rediscovered a couple of times since the 19th century. Most recently, however, probably the most successfully. And that was because of one man, a biologist named Claude Arnault. He also was from Juillac, but he didn't learn about Jeanne Villepreux-Power until after he was older, retired, and moved back to his hometown. Once there, he started learning about her, and he was amazed at all she had done and amazed at the fact that no one knew about her. He decided to change all that. This was the 1990s, and at the same time he was learning all about Jeanne, well, NASA was sending out its Magellan probe to Venus, discovering all sorts of amazing features on this planet. And soon NASA announced that though many of the features were going to be given names of goddesses from ancient religions and cultures, many others of these features, mostly the calderas formed by volcanic eruptions, were going to be named based on public nominations of women of noteworthy accomplishment. Well, Claude Arnal was determined that Jeanne Villepreux-Power would have a caldera on Venus named after her. And so in 1997, NASA agreed, and so it is. Now, let me tell you the two main things I appreciated about this book. One was the way that the author, Dana Staff, incorporated so much of Villepreux-Power's own writings. I felt like I really got to know this woman, and boy, was she interesting. Yes, I got to know about what she was studying, the Argonauts, and that was really interesting too. But because I was hearing from Jeanne Villepreux-Power in her own words, yeah, I felt like I really got to know her and understand her, and that was a lot of fun. The second thing I really appreciated about this book was the way it was so full of so many different types of media. I mentioned the maps, there are a lot of them. Sidebars, in which Staff expands on material that is only touched on in the main theme of the book, but which I think she wants young people to become more aware about. But you know what? As an adult, I learned just as much from them. Although I think the book was intended for a middle grade audience, I can't be sure because Staff does such a great job at not talking down to anyone. This book is filled with information everyone could benefit from no matter what their age. Wood engravings, however inaccurate they might be, paintings like this one of the Messina Harbor, and detailed scientific diagrams. So if you've never read this book, The Lady and the Octopus, How Jeanne Villepreux-Power Invented Aquariums and Revolutionized Marine Biology, might I suggest you get your hands on it and read it, because I guarantee you won't regret it. So if you haven't yet read anything for Octember, what are you waiting for? You've still got 2 weeks in September, so plenty of time. Grab yourself a book about octopuses or any other kind of cephalopod and enjoy the rest of Octember learning about these amazing, intelligent, gorgeous creatures. Until next time, I'm wishing you a lot of happy, interesting reading. Right? Yeah.